we'll get into more of that. And the third day I'll also use to hopefully cover some of the things that people bring up on the internet or here live that might be more requests. I'm flexible when it comes to the things. I want to give you in general whatever you need to get things done in Photoshop. Now, when I'm going through this, a couple things you should know. One of them is there are certain things I'm going to ignore, and those are anything that you don't need an expert to tell you how to use. If there's something that it's something that's either obvious on your own by just glancing at it, or if you clicked on it, it would be obvious once you got into it, might not cover it. I want to cover what I consider to be the most important things, than the things that I use every single day. And that means I'm not going to go over every single preference that exists. I'll go over whatever preferences I actually change. I'm going to concentrate on the things that I use 80% of my images, that kind of thing. I should also mention that anytime you see me working in Adobe Bridge, which is what I'll be in when I'm viewing thumbnails of my images, and anytime I'm in Camera Raw, those two areas of Photoshop are things that you could replace with Adobe Lightroom. And so if you own Adobe Lightroom and you see me do anything, and I mean anything, in Bridge or Camera Raw, those are things that you could do in Lightroom. And you should do in Lightroom if you have it. So anytime I leave Bridge or I leave Adobe Camera Raw and I'm in Photoshop, where you see all the palettes around and you can get to the menus and everything, that's when you'd need to leave Lightroom and pop into Photoshop. Right? Sometimes there are things that could be done in Camera Raw or in Lightroom, but I choose to do in Photoshop because they might be more user-friendly in some ways, because Camera Raw and Lightroom are limited in the way that they can work, because anything you do in either Camera Raw or in Lightroom has to be able to be saved in a little text file, where it doesn't actually save the pixels that make up your picture. It saves a description of where all the sliders were moved to within that area. And because of that, it's limited in what it can do. And so sometimes that gets in your way where you have to work around it too much, and it's more convenient to be in Photoshop. So just remember, anything I do in Bridge or in Camera Raw, if you have Lightroom, go for it, do it there. In fact, the math that is behind the adjustments that is in Adobe Camera Raw is the same as the math that is behind Lightroom. So moving the slider will do an identical change. Okay? So what I want to do is just get into Photoshop. I'm going to start off actually in Bridge because we just need to know how to navigate our files. But Bridge is something where it's not critical to know everything that's there. I just want to show you what I'm going to be using during class. And then we're going to get into Camera Raw, because Camera Raw is where you can get the most quality out of your image. If we ignore Camera Raw, head all the way into the main part of Photoshop, then we're going to be more limited in what we can do. I always get the most out of my image as much as I can when I'm in Camera Raw. So let's take a look. This is Bridge that I have running right now, and it should be set up with default settings. I reset my preferences on both Bridge and on Photoshop before we got started, and I haven't changed anything. And that way, if there's any preference I need to change or anything I like to do, you'll see me do it. And so let's take a look. The first thing I'm going to do is just set up Bridge the way I like it, and that is I go to the left side where you see a tab called Filter, and I'm going to double click on that. When you double click on it, it will collapse it down. If you need to get to that area again, you can just double click on the word Filter again to expand it. This is where you could limit the number of images you're viewing so that you could only view, let's say, TIFF files, or only view images that you've rated a certain amount, that kind of thing. We're not going to need to do that right now, so I'm going to double click on that and hide it. On the right side is an area for metadata. And metadata is where you can look at things like the shutter speed you used, what lens you shot with, what was the date you shot it, that kind of stuff. We're not going to need to look at that all that often, so I'm going to double click on that so that I can get this preview area to be larger. I like my preview to be bigger so I can click between my images and then get a better view of it. So I'm going to click on the vertical line that separates the preview from the thumbnails that are over here. You just click near that vertical line and just drag it to the left to make that area bigger. Then on the left side is where I navigate my computer. And I can navigate it in two different ways. One is through favorites. So if there are folders I need to go to all the time, I can save them here in my favorites. If you navigate to a particular folder, in one of the menus up here, you will find a choice of saving to favorites. It's right here, add to favorites. So after you've navigated to the folder that you'd like to access, you just go up to this menu, choose add favorites, and it would then appear over here. Or if you don't want to do it by favorites, you can click on the tab called folders, and that's where I'm going to be. And this is where I can manually navigate my hard drive. And I just click on any one of these folders, and over here it'll show me my thumbnails. And I can click between different folders. At the top, there'll be a bar right across above those thumbnails, and that bar tells you the path to the folder you're currently in. So in order to get to this folder, if I just open my hard drive without using Bridge, this is the path I'd have to take to get there. And if I want to navigate back within that navigation, I just click on any one of the folders that are listed there, and I can go back to different levels on my hard drive. If I want to go deeper on my hard drive, that's when I use the list of folders that's on the left. So I can come in here and navigate through things. So this is how I usually have Bridge set up. I just have my folders over here so I can navigate them. I'm viewing the images in the middle. And if I click on one of the images, I will see a big preview of it on the right. And that's how I'm going to be working. To switch between the various images we're going to use, I'm just going to be clicking on these various folders. All I have is a folder on my desktop and some subfolders within it. And when I need to move backwards, if this part's visible, I'll just click between the folders. Otherwise, if I need to go back a level, I use that little bar above the thumbnails. Bridge is installed if you have Photoshop installed. So if you haven't used it in the past by chance, as long as you installed Photoshop, Bridge got installed as well. It's in the same folder that Photoshop is usually stored in. And if you happen to have Photoshop running, you can go to the File menu, and there's a choice in there called Browse in Bridge. That would automatically launch it. So if you didn't feel like navigating your hard drive to find it, and you know you have Photoshop running, just go to the File menu, Browse in Bridge. So this is what we're going to be using for going through things. I don't want to cover all that much about Bridge because Bridge is not, in general, that difficult to learn. It's something where you don't really need an expert to walk you through everything. It's something where I want to concentrate on what is most critical and more difficult to learn. Okay? So the first place I always start with my images is a dialog box that's called Camera Raw. Some people abbreviate that as ACR. That stands for Adobe Camera Raw. Okay? And so in order to access the RAW dialog box, if you have a RAW file, meaning you set your camera to shoot, instead of shooting with JPEG, you're shooting in RAW format, then all you need to do is double-click on an image within Bridge. It'll automatically pop open into Camera Raw. If, on the other hand, you're not working with RAW files, instead you're working with JPEG files or TIFF files, then when you're in Bridge, you'd click once on your picture because double-clicking on it would bypass Camera Raw and open it all the way into Photoshop. Instead, you would go up to the File menu and you will find a choice called Open in Camera Raw. And that would force a JPEG file or a TIFF file that wouldn't usually automatically be open with Camera Raw to open in there. The main limitation is if you have a TIFF file and it has any layers in it, it can't work on that. It's got to be a flattened one that doesn't have any layers. So if you ever find a TIFF file that doesn't work, you probably open it up and you'll see that it's not just a picture. It's a picture with some layers on top of it. So then what I have is a bunch of folders here full of images that I think need help. And a lot of these images I've never worked on before, because I don't want to just work on stuff that I know exactly where the sliders need to go to fix them. I just need images that are messed up that I can work with. And some of the times, the tools we use won't be able to fix something. And I want to make sure we run into some of that. So you might see, how do I deal with it? Do I have to go into Photoshop and do more, or what? So with a lot of these images, I have no idea what I'm going to do to them. And that's good, because that's how you are when you open your images, right? Another thing with Bridge, right now my previews are really small. In the bottom, near the right side, you'll find a slider down here. That controls how big the thumbnails are. So if I just grab that, bring her up, we can see larger thumbnails. So these images here are ones that I thought need improvement. This is in a folder called Underexposed. See if you agree. Okay, we're going to try to fix all those. Let's hope it works. These are ones that I thought were somewhat overexposed in some areas, although a few of these have already been adjusted in Camera Raw, and I'll have to turn off the adjustment for you to see that. But this one, the sky gets pretty bright. Here are some that are lacking contrast I thought we'd work on. Here are some that have too much contrast. Then we have some that have color issues and other things. And we're just going to roll through them, and as we do, learn about all the things that are necessary for doing that. So let's start off working on some underexposed images, and let's just figure out how to think about some of the controls that are critical in Camera Raw. So these are RAW files. These were shot in a Canon camera, and a Canon camera's RAW file format ends in CR2. If you have a Nikon, it'll end in NEF. That's the file extension. Each camera vendor will have a different file extension on the end. But if you had your camera set to shoot RAW, they will have a file extension similar to those. Now, the reason why I end up shooting RAW is because your camera can capture thousands and thousands of brightness levels. But if you set it to capture JPEG, which is the default setting on my camera, then it only saves 250 brightness levels. And 250 brightness levels is fine for viewing an image on screen or printing it. The image can look great if it looked great on the little screen in the back of your camera. But if it didn't look good on the little screen in the back of your camera and you really need to fix it, like this one, then a JPEG file is going to fall apart very quickly, where there's just only 256 brightness levels, whereas a RAW file would have thousands upon thousands of brightness levels. There's more brightness levels than we really need in a RAW file. And what that allows us to do is do radical adjustments to it that you couldn't get away with a JPEG. Okay? And so that's why I primarily shoot RAW. Having said that, know that you can still apply these adjustments to a JPEG file. It's just don't expect the quality to be as high when you're done, and don't expect to be able to move the sliders as far as I do before the image starts looking terrible. Okay? So let's take a look here. We got a bunch of sliders. There's only a few we mainly need to think about when it comes to underexposed images. When it comes to underexposed images, it's mainly the blacks, the shadows, and sometimes the exposure sliders that we'll have to work with. So let's try to figure out how those work and how they relate to this bar chart that's at the top. This bar chart tells me the tonal range that's in my picture, just the brightness range that's in it. And I really wish they would put a little bar at the bottom of it where they would put black on the left, white on the right, and then all the shades in between there, like a little gradient bar. It would make this bar chart so much easier to understand if you had that there. They actually do it in parts of Photoshop. If I go into Photoshop here and I go up to levels, you'll see it. They put it in there. Do you see this bar right here with black on the left, white on the right, and all the different shades in between? Imagine that bar, you could copy it and you put it in Camera Raw. Imagine you put it right underneath this bar chart. Okay? I so wish it could be there. Because all this bar chart does is it tells you what brightness levels are in your picture. If there's a bar above a particular shade of gray, then that shade is in your picture somewhere. If there's not, then that shade's not found in your image. And so you just have to imagine there's a bar there with black on the left, white on the right. And so if that was the case, and I looked on the far right here, I would see that there is no white in this picture because there's no bar chart above the area that would be white. I would see that the brightest shade in the entire picture is right about here. And if I had that gradient below, I could look straight down and see exactly how bright it is. But instead, I just know it's nowhere near white. Okay? Then the height of the bars. First off, when I'm talking about the bars, ignore the colors. Just look at the white part. The colors have to do with saturation and color. Right now, I'm just talking about what I'll call tonality. Tonality is just the brightness of stuff, regardless of what color it is. And that's what the white part of this thing is. If you look at this, one of the bars will always go all the way to the top. That's whatever shade in your picture is the most prevalent. It's most common in the picture. It takes up the most space, however you want to say it. But the bar that goes to the top just means that's the stuff that takes up the most space. So if you look at this particular bar chart, you notice that all the tall stuff is on the left, isn't it? And that means really dark stuff takes up a lot of space. And if you look at the picture, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? And really bright stuff, there either is none of it because there's no bar chart over here, or the bars that do start there, they're all pretty short, aren't they? That means that the bright stuff doesn't take up much space. Okay? And notice on the far left, the absolute left edge, there's a bar that goes up quite high. The absolute left edge is where black is. And so that tells me I have a large area of solid black. Okay? Don't stress about this thing. It's like your speedometer in your car. You don't stare at it when you're driving. You glance down on occasion and just see if it's helpful, right? Same thing here. So we'll try to get a little bit more comfortable with this as time goes on. So with this image, what I notice is the tall stuff is all on the far left. And that means we have a tremendous amount of dark stuff. And there's nothing anywhere close to white. So it looks like I could just take this entire thing and shove it to the right. That means make things brighter, and it might look better. Anytime I see a huge gap on the right and a big spike on the left, what I do is I go for exposure. Exposure will take that whole thing and move it left or right. So watch what happens when I bring exposure up. You see the bar chart? See it spreading out, moving towards the right? Keep going there, keep going, okay. And the image is looking a little bit different. If I want to see before and after, there's a preview checkbox. I'll turn that off. Here's before, here's after. But still, that's not looking so hot, is it? We've got a lot more work to do. But if you look at our bar chart, it's starting to spread across, meaning that we do have bright stuff now. And our dark stuff isn't so shoved over next to black yet. Yeah? So now the other sliders we have to work with for an underexposed image is the next slider I would think about is the one called blacks. The time I use the slider called blacks is when I look at the bar chart and I see a spike on the left side. If the very first bar that makes up the bar chart is tall, then I want to use blacks. What blacks does is it works on the absolute darkest part of your picture, however dark that happens to be. If I move the slider towards the right, you'll brighten that. If I move it towards the left, you'll darken it. And so what happens is with a raw file, there's additional highlight and shadow detail that it doesn't show you to begin with, that you have to move these sliders to make show up. So if you have highlights that look like they're blown out solid white, there might still be data in there that can be recovered. Same thing in your shadows. You might have areas that look solid black, but there's actually extra data in there. That's not true with a JPEG file. With a JPEG file, if something in your image looks to be solid white, it is solid white, and there's no more data coming back there. If there's something solid black in your picture, same thing. You're stuck with solid black. But with a raw file, there's a little extra leeway in the highlights and the shadows where we can bring back detail. So this little bar right here on the far left tells me black takes up an all right amount of space. I want to see if I can get some of that detail back, and so I go to the black slider. I move it towards the right, and I'm looking at the bar chart right now and seeing if I can get that spike to go away. And I was able to. So that means that black